We're saying, well, if you allow the Bitcoin mining industry to come into your state and you adopt it and you let it grow, you're going to see more jobs, more local investment, more grid stability, more environmental cleanup, and the ability to enhance green and renewable energy projects. And there's really just not a policymaker on the planet who doesn't like those things.
This is the Bitcoin Effect, where we talk about Bitcoin and its effects on politics, society, and economics. Stick around a while and let me know in the comments what you'd like us to cover in future videos. In this episode, we have a conversation with Dennis Porter with the Satoshi Action Fund to focus on some of the important work they're doing at the state legislative level to pave the way for Bitcoin miners to do business in the United States and to defend against attempts to make it more difficult to do so.
We have Satoshi Action, right? You know about Satoshi Action Fund.
Right.
That was the one that we started in June of last year. And then this year, we launched Satoshi Action Education, which is the research and education arm of Satoshi Action. And it essentially is used as a way for us to tackle one of Bitcoin's greatest problems. And that great problem is the lack of peer-reviewed research in the Bitcoin space. So we've brought on Dr. Murray Rudd, and he's got 20 years of experience in academia, and he's going to be leading that effort. But the stuff that he knows, his expertise, which one of his expertise is using science and research to influence policy, right? Because like, what are you ultimately doing if you're in the research and science space? Like, you're not just doing science just to do science. Like, you want people to see what you've done and go, oh, maybe we shouldn't be doing that, or maybe we should be doing that. Like one example would be, in the field of medicine, like, you're not just doing science about medicine to not come up with a cure for cancer so that you can just say you created it on paper. Like, you actually want the end result of your research in the cancer field to be, making sure people either heal from cancer or don't get cancer, right? Like, you're not just doing science for the sake of science. So there's a whole process that's being used in the academic world. It's a little newer to be able to tackle that. And we've started to bring that process into the organization. I'm really big on strategy. So the strategy for Satoshi Action Fund is, go at the state level, follow the marijuana industry, what they did, similar to also the kind of like the solar industry, and start fighting for advancements at the state level instead of just kind of like spending all of our time in DC, where you could spend millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, and not get the result that you want. Instead,
you kind of got me at the marijuana industry and how there's actually a roadmap that you're kind of not following, but you've recognized that they've done some things within the legislative process that you say that you'd like to utilize or at least emulate as far as Bitcoin legislation is concerned. Can you kind of expound on how you kind of came across that?
For a long time, the marijuana industry struggled to gain a foothold for their rights and for their issues. And so ultimately what ended up happening was they switched their strategy to being focused on the benefits that the marijuana industry can provide at the state level, instead of just trying to say, oh, this is my right, I should be allowed to put in my body whatever I want to put in my body. I love freedom just as much as the next person to do what I want with my body, but that's not a winning argument for state legislators or for really any policymaker, to be honest. I'll take that back. There are some policymakers who may go die on that hill, but very few will. So instead, what the marijuana industry did was in like the early 2010s is they adjusted their strategy to start talking about the economic benefits of the marijuana industry and social benefits of the marijuana industry. And the key benefits, and you can go look it up. You can see all their advocacy tools. So this is something I studied quite a bit, is they started to pitch the marijuana industry as an economic boon to states that adopted it, and also as a way to reduce crime. The thing that they did, though, is early 2010s strategically was say, this will bring in tax revenue, this will bring in jobs, it'll increase property prices because you're going to reduce crime. And those pitches, those like points, worked really well for policymakers. They like those things. Everybody loves jobs. Policymakers love extra tax money, especially if they don't have to go increase taxes on the broader public. So we're just pitching the same thing. We're doing the same thing that the marijuana industry is doing. We're saying, well, if you allow the Bitcoin mining industry to come into your state and you adopt it and you let it grow, you're going to see, more jobs, more local investment, more grid stability, more environmental cleanup, and the ability to enhance green and renewable energy projects. And there's really just not a policymaker on the planet who doesn't like those things. Even if you go to like deep, like South Texas, I mean, they have some of the most, they have more renewables than most people do in the States, in the country. So they're very, pro trying to figure out how to make renewables work for the grid. So that being said, it's just an easy strategy. It's very simple. It's pattern recognition. See what worked before and use that strategy and maybe actually build on top of it. The marijuana industry started in blue states. We're starting in red states. Marijuana industry got Washington and Colorado first. We got Montana and Arkansas first. And we're just going to keep building from there. Marijuana industry started with those two states, moved to now 75% of the country. And we think we can do the exact same thing. Not just because, we're gung-ho about Bitcoin, but because we've seen people do it before.
You talked about Arkansas and Montana. Those are two bills that I know Satoshi Action has helped to get passed in those two states. What was the process in that, and how did those victories actually come about?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for us, you have phases of our organization. So right now we're in what's called the off-season phase. Most state legislators don't meet year-round. They're these are volunteers, more or less. They barely get paid. In some states, they don't really get, they're almost full, just literal volunteers. So they'll work, most of the state legislators, it's like 3 to 4 months. Now, everywhere except for like the year-round legislators like California, New York, Ohio is kind of somewhat quasi year-round, and so is North Carolina. I believe there's 1 or 2 other states in there. Don't quote me. It's kind of hard. It's hard to remember every state's calendar exactly. But what happens is you kind of have this period where when they're in session, like you need to get it all done during that period. If you don't, then your bill is dead. You got to wait till next year. So we're in this season where you prep for that period right now. So about this time last year is when we launched, and we immediately turned around as soon as we launched and said, okay, we got to start crafting model policy. Model policy is essentially, it's just like what it sounds like. Here's a model of what a policy that your state should pass should look like. It doesn't need to be exactly like this.
Do those look the same for pretty much every state, or does that model policy have to be customized based on who you're talking to?
It is roughly the same for every state because you leave it you leave it broad. Like you don't nail it down to the state's specific code. That's actually the job of the folks that work at the state legislature to draft it into the state's code. They're called drafters. So once you get the model policy, once you have the model policy, you're going around, you're kind of shopping it around, trying to find state policymakers that want to pass that policy. You give it to them. They might put some tweaks and some movements on it, make it more specific. They might add something to it. They might take something away, and then they will send that into the drafters. And these are just more or less like underpaid lawyers who are hired by the state to take your idea and put it into state code, because every state is vastly different. So nobody could, I would never be able to craft policy that's specific to every single state. Not even one state, to be honest. I'm just not an expert on it, but very few people could craft it in maybe more than a few states, because you have to know ins and outs of that state code. So once they get done with it, then it gets officially introduced and gets a bill number. And then from there, you move through committee. So if it's on the House side, you go to a House committee. Sometimes it's a second layer committee, depending on the state. Most states, it's just one. Once you get through committee, you go to House floor vote, and then you repeat the same process on the opposite side in the Senate. And so vice versa. If you start in the Senate, you introduce, you go to committee, then you pass on the Senate floor, then you do it over on the House side. You can do these processes at the same time also in the House and the Senate. Depends on where you are. Some places you have to start one side, work it all the way through, then hop over. Some places it's like you're doing it almost the exact same, more or less the exact same time. You can never make it perfect. Just depends on kind of the dynamics. It's all very kind of not the same. Every situation is different. That's kind of one of the things I like about the political space, though, is you're constantly faced with new challenges, with sort of new hurdles that you have to overcome, and you have to think very critically, okay, how am I going to get past this hurdle to the next spot?
It sounds to me, though, it seems to me it would be easier to see one bill go through one chamber and then have that bill be considered in the other chamber, as opposed to having them try to coordinate and meet in the middle to create one bill that's going to go to a governor's desk to be passed into law. Is that the case, or am I mistaken on that?
It can be easier from a logistics standpoint just because you're only spending time with one office. But one of the dynamics of state policy work is that you want to get it done as fast as possible, because if you wait till the deadline to get it done and you go past the deadline, then your bill is dead. So this is a powerful tool to kill bills if you don't like a bill. This is what we did in Texas with HB 1751, anti-Bitcoin mining bill there. But it can also work against you if you have your own policy. So you don't mind necessarily working them at the same time. And then what happens is it doesn't really matter the whole dynamic of like whether it's happening the same time or not. It's once they both pass in the House and the Senate, if they're not identical, then you do what's called a crossover. You have in some states, you have a conference committee. This is common in Texas. So if they're different, if there's like amendments that were made in the process, changes, then you come to a conference committee, you agree on what you keep and what you don't keep and the differences, and then you move it past through committee, and then finally vote on it again.
Okay. When we come back, I want to talk to Dennis about the wins that they've had in Arkansas and Montana. And I also, because he talked about the off season, I'm going to ask him about what states are going to be the new battlegrounds as the legislative sessions begin to ramp back up this fall. So we'll be right back. Thanks for joining us here at The Effect. If you're enjoying the video, I hope you'll consider clicking the like, subscribing to the channel, and dropping a comment with topics you'd like us to cover or guests you'd like us to have a conversation with. Let's get back to it. All right, we're back with Dennis Porter from Satoshi Action Fund and Satoshi Education. Did I say that right?
Satoshi Action Education is the second one. It's the same thing twice, but one's education, one's fund.
Okay. And what we're talking about is different states that have had, two of them in particular, that have had wins legislatively for Bitcoin mining. One of them is in Arkansas. The other is in Montana. Let me start with this. What were some of the obstacles that you faced, and how did you come, and you can do one at a time or both of them, it doesn't matter to me. What were the obstacles? And how did you finally come upon a bill that the governors actually signed into law to protect and actually encourage Bitcoin mining in those states?
Yeah, so Montana and Arkansas couldn't be more opposite of a story when it came to kind of like getting it across the finish line. In Arkansas, which was the first state where we passed that policy, our policy director, Eric Peterson, was working very efficiently with the policymaker there on the ground, but also with the newly established Arkansas Blockchain Council people that were putting that together kind of like simultaneously as we were pushing this effort through. And that policy probably was like broke a record. We introduced it and passed it in 1 week. And it was like no sort of problems at all whatsoever. Wow. There was some like minutia problems. Obviously, you always face pushback, questions, concerns, but ultimately it was probably the easiest policy we'll ever pass in my life. And in Montana, different story. You know, it was a long-term game. We were working there with Senator Zolnikov, who is a state senator there in Montana, who really understands Bitcoin mining and the value that it has to offer on a very deep level. Like, we didn't have to convince him to want to attract Bitcoin mining to his state. Really big fan of him and the work that he's doing up there in Montana. And we worked through the process. We went and visited. We testified. It was a great, had some great testimony. We actually had some folks show up and try to oppose us. And I don't know, there's a video clip that you can find where a gentleman is saying that the state of Montana will die on the cross of Bitcoin. I mean, the guy puts in a very interesting speech. I'll have to share it with you later. Maybe you can show a clip to the audience. But that process was going smoothly. We were working through it. We met some great folks up there. Some of the folks on the committee in the initial Senate side were really open-minded. And I was actually very surprised also that some of them knew a lot about Bitcoin. In fact, a senator up there, Senator Smalls, he came up to me and he's like, all right, what are we talking about here? He was just kind of like, tell me what you're trying to do in my state. Kind of, you're not going to get anything by me. I had no idea that if he knew anything about Bitcoin or not. So I started talking to him about it and, kind of came to the realization that he knew quite a bit about Bitcoin. It was really interesting. And later on in that evening, another gentleman walked up and, he said, tell him about Bitcoin. Tell him what you're trying to do, Senator Smalls. I was like, okay. So I started telling him about the history of Bitcoin. And he goes, No. You need to start from the very, very beginning. And he starts quoting like verbatim pre-Bitcoin history, like cypherpunk history.
Oh, wow.
And I was just kind of like blown away. I was like, this guy knows more about the history of Bitcoin, like off the cuff. These are things that I've heard, but he was just like reciting it off the cuff. And I asked him, I was like, how do you know so much about Bitcoin? And he's like, I don't watch very much TV and I read a lot. It's like, okay. So, needless to say, we had a lot of great conversations up there. It was a long kind of trajectory, long arc conversation with all sorts of interesting highlights along the way. The most interesting one was when we got to one of the final votes. I believe it was the literal final vote on the House side. It was about to get passed, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there was this like uprising of opposition to the bill. They go through readings there. So you go through one reading, you vote, you pass it. Go second reading, vote, you pass it. On the third reading in Montana, you vote and you pass it, and it's done. Then it goes on to the other chamber or to the governor. In this instance, it was going to go on to the governor. On the third reading, out of nowhere, this is extremely uncommon, there was this just like hustle and bustle, and the bill actually died. They killed the bill. They voted it down. And luckily, we were working with some really great folks on the ground there, really understood the system. And they were able to kind of like pause. You can do these little things there where you can pause and be like, hey, motion to reconsider. Let's go take another look at this. And so they put a motion to reconsider. They pulled it all back from the like jaws of death, so to speak. Got all these, whipped a bunch of votes, and then passed it. But they called me and they were like, okay, the bill is actually dead right now. And we're trying to revive it. And we thought this whole time, we're like, this thing is going to fly with flying colors. There's going to be no sorts of problems. We've done a really good job educating people. We spent a lot of time with everyone. We got a really supportive senator. Everyone's on board. At the last moment, I don't know why, there was this really strong effort to kill this bill. And somehow our team was able to resuscitate it, so to speak, and bring it back to life. And then we ended up passing it. And then it obviously went on to the governor's desk, and he signed it. So, totally different story from it. We introduced it and we passed it in 1 week.
And then you have fear absolutely just take over because you're like, dude, we're 2-0. What just happened?
Yeah. It was, the first reading went fine. Second reading, totally fine. Third reading out of nowhere, which is again, super uncommon and no one was expecting it, but we had some really great people there on the ground that we couldn't think enough to make sure that we were able to get that policy passed.
That's good news. So basically, and basically in Arkansas and Montana, then you have the right to mine Bitcoin. What does that exactly mean? So when Bitcoin miners are looking at different places to stake their claim and start doing business, why are Arkansas and Montana now the places that Bitcoin miners are going to want to look?
Yeah. So the Bitcoin policy that we passed, the pro-Bitcoin policy that we passed, right to mine, does several things. It protects Bitcoin miners from rate discrimination, which is common. We've seen it, even though it's not allowed. We're just firming that up in the law that they cannot discriminate against Bitcoin miners and say, hey, here's this rate for you. And, it's worse than everybody else within your industry, within the data center industry, but we don't trust you. We don't like you. So that's why we're doing it. We're also protecting against discriminatory zoning changes. So in fact, in the state of Montana, in Missoula, they were rezoning certain parts of that county with the intention of kicking Bitcoin miners out. And they actually drove some Bitcoin miners bankrupt because of that. So we protect against that. Okay. Another thing that it does is it protects Bitcoin miners or exempts Bitcoin miners from money transmitter licenses. Money transmitter licenses, there's a whole state level regime of money transmitter licenses that you have to apply for, and it just would be dubious. I mean, the economic like hurdle that you'd have to overcome in every single state to be able to operate, it generally wouldn't be worth it for most Bitcoin miners. So they haven't tried to do that yet, but we did that like preemptively to prevent that.
Okay, so those are basically kind of lumped into state banking laws. Is that kind of where we're at here?
I'm not a state banking expert, although we are thinking about bringing someone in to help us with that. But it's generally the way you should view money transmitter laws is like, are you bringing money in, holding it, and then moving it around as a business? And if you're doing that, then you generally have to apply for what's called a money transmitter license. But Bitcoin miners aren't actually, as if you look deep within the technology, they're never holding your money for you.
Right.
They don't, like, when you put a Bitcoin transaction out, it doesn't go sit with a Bitcoin miner and they like hold on to it and then send it somewhere else. There's a whole term that they use with the way to describe it. Again, I'm not a state banking expert. I'm not even a money transmitter license expert, but some people have been saying that, oh, well, Bitcoin miner is processing a transaction. Well, they must need a money transmitter license. But we believe that Bitcoin miners should be exempt from money transmitter licenses because they never actually possess and then like send that money forward out of their possession to someone else.
It changes the definition of process as far as banking or money transmission is concerned.
The last thing is that it protects from frivolous noise complaints. So we've seen a lot of frivolous noise complaints across the country, and so that also protects against frivolous noise complaints.
Okay.
Now that being said, the reason why this policy did well is because we didn't go out there and we didn't say, Bitcoin miners can do whatever the hell they want. You can't do anything about it. It was reasonable policy where we said Bitcoin miners should not be discriminated against, but we also don't want to remove the ability for local governments to protect themselves against bad actors. And in fact, we're very interested as an organization in helping the industry mature and grow beyond bad actors. Some bad actors in the space just don't care. They go into a community. They don't try to mitigate their noise. They don't try to communicate with the local, jurisdiction, or maybe it could be the local populace. And they start causing all sorts of problems for that local community. Well, no, that's not good for anybody, right? Because then all of a sudden you have a community that thinks that Bitcoin miners are just bad, come and take it all kind of an industry, when that very much the opposite is true. But all it takes is a couple of bad actors kind of moving around from county to county as they get kind of pushed out.
Which inadvertently gives Bitcoin the network and Bitcoin the monetary device a bad reputation anyway.
That's right. That's exactly right. So I personally want to see way more Bitcoin mining take place here in the United States. That's kind of my whole purpose of Satoshi Action, is to make sure that the United States is one of the best places to mine in the entire world. I have a whole thesis behind why I think that's important. But ultimately, if we're going to do that, not only are we going to have to pass pro-Bitcoin mining policy, we also need to be reasonable pro-Bitcoin mining policy that still ensures that bad actors are not about to like roam free and cause all sorts of problems, because that will turn whether it be voters, whether it be policymakers, it'll turn them against the industry and be like, oh, no, we don't want these guys here. We think that they're bad actors. They're always bad actors. We've only had a bad experience with them. So we want to make sure that is limited. We don't want to see bad actors be given free reign. So that's part of the reason why the policy did well. You can't just go in and say, Bitcoin miners get to do whatever the hell they want. Screw the government. Like, that's not going to work ever. You have to come in with something reasonable. And we felt like we hit that tone really well with this policy.
On our next episode of The Bitcoin Effect, we'll continue our conversation with Dennis Porter about an anti-Bitcoin bill in Texas that almost got passed, how Satoshi Action helped to get it defeated, and what led to the bill being introduced to begin with. I hope you join me again next time on The Bitcoin Effect.